welcome back. Today we'll cover a kind of informal fallacy called fallacy of emotional appeal. And there are various examples that we will give for this. So fallacies based on emotional appeal are arguments that rely on the arousal of a strong emotional state or psychological reaction to get us to accept a conclusion. So the reason this is fallacious is because your emotional state or psychological reaction, if that's the motivation for getting you to accept a conclusion, well, you can't really say that the emotional state or the psychological reaction is a good guide to the truth of the conclusion. So, for example, Your Honor, before you sentence my client for the murder of his parents, I ask you to consider his situation. He's an orphan. You wouldn't put an orphan in jail, would you? So here, the lawyer is appealing to the judge's pity that this boy is an orphan. He doesn't, you want to give him, you want to make his life worse. He's already an orphan. Now you want to put him in jail. Don't you feel so bad for him? Well, whether or not the judge should feel pity for this orphan is independent of whether or not this orphan is himself responsible for the fact that he is an orphan, right? Because he's being accused of murdering his parents. So the lawyer, in order to get the judge to determine whether or not he should sentence the client for the murder of his parents, the lawyer should appeal to the evidence that the orphan is innocent, rather than appeal to the emotions of the judge. And if you accept something because of an emotional state or psychological reaction, well, then you're not accepting for the right reasons. You should be accepting of a conclusion because you think that the conclusion is true, not because it gets you to feel a certain way. So the bandwagon fallacy is an emotional appeal. It's an attempt to get a person to accept a claim or course of action because, quote unquote, everyone's doing it, right? So, a teenager might say, Mom, Dad, you have to let me go to that party. Everybody's going to the party. And then, of course, the parent is going to say, if everyone wanted to jump off of a cliff, would you? If everyone jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? And however annoying that sort of cliched response is, however annoying it is to hear from your parents, they're right. Just because everyone's doing something, or just because everyone believes something, it doesn't mean that everyone should do that thing or everyone should believe that thing. And just because everyone's doing it or everyone's believing it, it doesn't mean you should do it or you should believe it. Here's an example. You still believe in capital punishment? Come on. No one believes in that anymore. This is fallacious because the number of people who subscribe to some claim or who are doing some thing is independent of whether or not the claim is true or whether the thing should be done, right? So instead of saying, I can't accept capital punishment because nobody accepts that nowadays, you should say, what reason is there for thinking capital punishment is a good policy? What reason is there for thinking it's a bad policy? And I should accept it or reject it based on those reasons, rather than peer pressure or something like that, the desire to fit in. Now here's an example of the bandwagon fallacy. It's quite funny, I think.
If you were to follow a busy doctor as he makes his daily round of calls, you'd find yourself having a mighty busy time keeping up with him. Time out for many men of medicine usually means just long enough to enjoy a cigarette. And because they know what a pleasure it is to smoke a mild, good-tasting cigarette, They're particular about the brand they choose. In a repeated national survey, doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" Once again, the brand named most was Camel. Yes, according to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days and see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment? See how Camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good tasting a cigarette can be.
Okay. So obviously, just because all these doctors who are really cool and respected, just because they smoke cigarettes, it doesn't mean that you should smoke cigarettes, right? And that's what the commercial was doing. It was saying, hey, look at these well-respected citizens, these authoritative citizens, these cool citizens who are smoking. You should smoke too. And at the end, you also have that lady. She's very pretty. She has a bright smile, and she's smoking. And so it's kind of appealing to your desire to fit in, your desire to be like that person, be like the doctor, be like the lady at the end, in order to accept that course of action. But of course, just because doctors are doing it, just because a pretty lady is doing it, doesn't mean that we should do it. We should look to see whether smoking is good or bad for you. Okay. Appeal to pity is another appeal to emotion that's fallacious. It relies exclusively on a sense of pity or mercy for support of a conclusion. But whether or not the conclusion is true is independent of how you feel about the conclusion. So take this argument here, which, sorry if it's a little too close to home, but I think you should give me an A in this class, professor. After all, I need an A in this class to keep my scholarship, and if I lose my scholarship, my parents will be mad. All right, so the claim is that you should give me an A in this class, and the evidence is that if you don't, I'll lose my scholarship and my parents will be mad. Well, the point is that simply because some bad consequences will result from not getting an A, it doesn't mean that the student deserves an A or that the professor should give the student an A, right? So appealing to the professor's emotions in order to try to get him to give you an A, well, if the professor gives in on that, and really I'm not trying to preach here or something, it's just an example, but if the professor gives in on that, then the professor is giving in for the wrong reasons. The real reason should be, did this student do the work that deserves an A? If not, then no A. If yes, then A. So it's fallacious because we shouldn't accept a claim as true or a course of action as appropriate simply because these things evoke an emotional response such as pity in us. Now, appeal to force is another fallacious appeal to emotion. So this is a fallacy that occurs when a threat of harmful consequences is used to force acceptance of a course of action that would otherwise be unacceptable. So here you have a sort of thug. He's pointing a knife at someone, and the person says, "Oh yes, I see your point." So the thug is getting this person to accept a belief or a course of action or whatever by force. And obviously this is fallacious, either to think that this is a good way to get people to accept conclusions, like a rational way to get people to accept conclusions or to accept conclusions on this basis. It might be practically rational, right? But it's not like logically reasonable. Practically rational, because if I don't see your point, then you're going to put a knife in me. So practically, I'm going to want to do it because I want to preserve myself. But from a logical perspective, obviously, simply because someone can force you to accept a conclusion, it doesn't mean that the conclusion is true or should be accepted from a logical standpoint. So here's a fun example from The Godfather of appeal to force.
Please, Michael, tell me.
My darling, until I saw you.
Well, when Johnny was first starting out, he was signed to this personal service contract from the big band leader. And as his career got better and better, he wanted to get out of it. Now, Johnny is my father's godson. And my father went to see this band leader. And he offered him $10,000 to let Johnny go. But the band leader said no. So the next day, my father went to see him, only this time with Luca Brazzi. Within an hour, he signed a release for a certified check of $1,000.
How did you do that?
My father made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
What was that?
Luca Brazzi held a gun to his head, and my father assured him that either his brains or his signature would be on the contract. That's a true story.
All right. So whether or not this person should have signed the contract, whether or not it was, say, a good contract that should have been signed, is not relevant to, the appeal to force. Your brains are going to be on that contract, or your signature is going to be on that contract. Now, sure, if you're in that situation, no one's going to blame you if you sign the contract. But that doesn't mean that the contract is a good contract. If someone has to, put a gun to your head, then probably, the contract's not good. They have to get you to sign it some other way. All right, so those are emotional appeals, and I think those are some of the easier fallacies to understand. And let's stay away from believing things because of the emotional response that they arise in us.